Hi, welcome to the Pursuit of Truth. It's been a little while since the last one, which was about the Titan. That time, everyone was given, the idea that they had emergency oxygen left and they might be found for 5 days. It turns out that I think it was the US Navy heard a sound that they weren't sure about at the very beginning, which was probably the when it exploded or imploded due to some kind of pressure leak. This hasn't been found out exactly what happened. I'm not sure why that information wasn't shared at that time, because we all had to, pray for these people that have already been dead for 5 days. And I suppose my conspiratorial head, as it were, does think that it's strange that this timing came like after the 5 days of oxygen ran out, and then they say they heard this sound, and the ship finally gets there after 5 days. That has the remote vehicle that finds the wreckage. I don't know whether when the oxygen ran out, would that have caused an event similar to an implosion or a pressure leak? And so has this just been brought out to, so that it sounds better for everyone that they died instantly rather than died, as I was worrying about, their last breaths and making videos on their phones and things. I don't know. It just seemed, I suppose they kept it to themselves because they didn't want people to give up, but I don't know. Anyway, that was that story. There's a few things I wanted to talk about. So let's get through to them. The first one is about Coke, the drink, or Spartane as it is. There's a report going out that it's going to be branded as carcinogenic, but it seems like some companies or some countries don't care about that. They're still going to say it's perfectly fine to drink. Maybe they just put a little bit of a warning on, like they do with cigarettes. But I don't understand the world we live in. This is the problem, because everything's about money and like keeping these major companies, happy and etc. Don't worry about health. You pretended to care about health when it came to COVID-19 because you wanted to also get vaxxed up. But now, you don't mind us eating all this red meat and all this extra things they put inside that could give us cancer, or certain ones of us who have genetic, what's the word I'm looking for? Some kind of genetic weakness. But yeah, here it is, so you can hear. So think twice before you drink Coke, I suppose I would say.
Let's take a look now at some of the day's other headlines. And a popular artificial sweetener found in diet, soft drinks and thousands of other foods and products is set to be declared a possible cause of cancer. The safety of aspartame has been debated for decades, but reviews by countries, including the UK, have not found it to be dangerous. It's reported the World Health Organization is set to make the possible carcinogen declaration next month.
Yeah, so there you go. WHO says apparently, during COVID times, everything that the WHO we listen to. But when it's the carcinogenic and Spartane and all these things, the UK, they're going to say it's fine. Just like they said Primodos was fine and all that kind of stuff. And this is the same people we have to trust with our lives. And the problem is like I always go on about this, because it's truth. The system that we live within just doesn't work. It was created by people who just wanted to keep power and be greedy and possessive. It doesn't have any benefit to the human nature of humanity or the well-being of individuals, of us, because it's all about money and competition, and that gets in the way of doing the right thing. Okay, so that's that one done. The next one, where is it? All from Sky News. What was the next one about? There's 2 stories on this one. One is first about the riots in France to do with the police. It looked like an assassination of I think it was 17-year-old Nahel, who was stopped in his car. They claimed that he was going to try and run them over or something, but the pictures we've seen is him, the car stationary and a gun in his face. And I don't understand the police sometimes, how they can't control their anger and do these things. And then try and make out that it's the other person's fault. But that's all criminals do that, isn't it? No matter what suit they wear, all criminals will lie about the things that they do. No criminal, or most criminals, don't put their hands up and admit responsibility. Most human beings don't admit responsibility to the wrong things that they do during their lifetime. But what was interesting to me about Sky News is how they like to make this whole debate about, whenever they go to these protests. And I don't know why they're so gung-ho on being anti-protest. I assume it's because they also are part of the government in the sense that they're part of the system. They want to keep the status quo. That they're scared of anarchy, as it were. They're scared of the people, the power of the people. They want that message to get across because, often the journalists don't write their own material. They get sent there by their big bosses, the big bosses up above, who are all part of the same, echelon of the running of the world that we live in. I'm not trying to be conspiratorial in that way, but what I mean is why did they have this view? This view that whenever there's a protest, it's all about denigrating it into a riot. And yeah, I know that the thing is, like with any protest, you're always going to get riots. You're always going to get people who come out to disrupt, who use it as a way to maybe steal things or cause disruption or be violent. The same as like people who join the army usually are people who are violent, because they want to kill people and they want to find a legal way of doing it. Or people who become policemen, police women. So this is just part of it. This is part of the ugly nature of humanity. But it's just how the media will try and portray it as young people doing it. And I bet if you ask like these journalists, like, can you give me the demographics of every single person that was at the riot? Were they all young people? Were they all, teenagers? Were there some 20, 30, 40, 50-year-olds throwing bottles, setting fires to things? Of course there were, stealing things. Of course there were. But it's just, they try and paint that picture. Like today they were showing him standing amongst old people, hearing them clatter, talking on in the background, just because then they wanted to create the image of the old people have all come out to say, oh, stop all this violence, you naughty people. If the people before had done their job, then the younger generation wouldn't have to put up with this shit and have to stand out there and say, no, this is wrong. I'm as mad as hell and I'm not going to take this anymore. Not that I'm trying to condone violence, but what I'm trying to say is that how, I guess the media's worried and the government's worried because once people realise that actually we all have the power, we're all equal in power, but we just all accept to be sheep. We all accept to live in a world that we all know isn't beneficial for each one of us. But we all think we can't do anything about it. I don't know. Protesting, it doesn't help anyway. The violence doesn't help anyway. Whatever happens here, it will just finish and then everyone will forget about it and everything, the status quo will then carry on. The problem is, like, all the police and the politicians, who say, well, what you really should be doing is going to your politician and writing a letter. Well, that fucking makes any difference, because that doesn't make any difference anyway. Democracy doesn't work. This idea of democracy, of power for the people and all that kind of stuff, it doesn't work. You vote, your democracy is that you create dictators, but you call them politicians. They all have the power. Those 20, 30 people that you elected, they all have the power over all of you. And they are just the same as a dictator, it's just a different name because you can't change them. If you've got a problem, you try write to your MP. You try and get things changed. I've tried to do it. Nothing happens. They always a comeback. You see the politicians arguing between each other like stupid school children. Nothing. They don't even have to answer questions or tell the truth. They just have to deflect. So it doesn't work, this idea of like, so what are you supposed to do? Tell me, how did all these conflicts, because like they say about riots and things, when it comes to Ireland, when it comes to South Africa, how was it that people got justice in the end? They had to riot, they had to do all these things, because waving flags or signs or the protests, they didn't always work, did they? If only we lived in a world where people actually did the right thing without the need of force or without the need of, just did the right thing in the first place. But we don't live in a world like that because of the system that we've designed doesn't encourage that. Anyway, I'm waffling on. This video will probably get removed now because of all this honesty that I'm telling. But it's just so frustrating that how do you change the world? Because none of it works. It doesn't matter whether you protest, it still won't work. Just stop oil, it won't work. They can carry on doing all that. People will just ignore it. It'll just be eventually the people in power, like with the abolition of slavery and all those other things that have happened. The people stood up and said it's wrong, but it never got changed until the people who can change it finally decide, yeah, we're going to change it. Probably because it's got some monetary benefit to them. Like they probably will, listen to climate change in the end because they can make money out of it. But it'll only be until that time that it will happen. And all their protests will, you'll think it's because of the cause and effect of protest that make it. Well, no, probably not. It's just those people that are in power decided, well, now we can make some money out of it, so we will change because it is beneficial for us now, not because it's the right thing to do.
These acts are totally unjustifiable, and I want to thank all those who worked overnight, as the night before, to protect these institutions and bring back calm.
Well, Sky's Europe correspondent Adam Parsons has the latest from the march in Nanterre.
This is the point where the march has got to very near its end. Now, this square here is very near to the point where Nahel, 17-year-old, was shot by the police, where was he then careered and crashed. So symbolically, this is a hugely important mark point in the story. Now, up to this point, this has been a tense, loud, but peaceful march. Not least, I think, because there was absolutely no police presence. When we got here, we did see police officers in significant numbers, and this is the result. We're now seeing clashes between police and marchers over this direction here. You can see fires breaking out. That smoke you can see there is tear gas, and flares have been thrown in the direction of police. So what we expected to happen has happened. Peaceful march has ended up in yet another confrontation in Nanterre.
Adam Parsons there, and we'll have more from Paris throughout.
Right, here's the next story, which I can't remember what it's about. I'll talk about it afterwards.
Undercover operations by the Metropolitan Police has found that deployments were unjustified and would have been stopped if the public had known what was going on. Well, the report looked at the conduct of 139 undercover officers and found that male police spies formed sexual relationships and fathered children with female activists from left-wing groups who didn't know their true identities. Dave Smith is a trade unionist who was spied on by undercover officers. He told Sky News that the inquiry's findings should have serious consequences for the Metropolitan Police.
This report that's come out today should be the final nail in the coffin of the Metropolitan Police.
Have you ever had an apology?
We've never had an apology for what they've done, but more and more reports, more and more public inquiries are finding the Met Police institutionally sexist, institutionally racist, institutionally corrupt, institutionally homophobic. And what this has done now is shown that anyone involved in genuine civic society, trade unions, environmental campaigns, political parties that are perfectly legal have been seen as a legitimate target in a war against their own citizens. This is an outrage, and the Met Police should be wound up for what has come out of this.
Well, the Metropolitan Police has apologised to victims and insisted that the force has changed.
People are going to want to know what's going on right now, and of course it wouldn't be appropriate for me to confirm or deny exactly what is happening right now because it would compromise it.
Well, do police officers still use deceased babies' names?
Absolutely not.
Do police officers sleep with women who do not know that they're police officers?
Absolutely not. I must say that it is absolutely abhorrent, the activities of those officers in the sexual relationships that they had. I apologise. We have already apologised. It should never have taken place, and managers should have known what was going on and stopped it.
Well, our correspondent Rachel Venables is in central London for us. Hello to you, Rachel. It's truly shocking to hear from some of these people who've had their lives affected by this undercover unit, just quite the impact it's had on people's lives.
A staggering impact on so many people. And I think what you have to understand about the various units in different forms that operated over the years is that they did this for more than 4 decades in different guises out of the Metropolitan Police here, starting in 1968. Now, the interim report which came out today only focused on the first 14 years of these units operating, targeting, as you've already heard, and spoken about, largely left-leaning political groups, campaigning organisations, political organisations, and also the likes of trade union bodies. Later on, these officers even ended up spying on the family of Stephen Lawrence and those campaigning around the family as they called for justice. So many people see this as a huge breach of their privacy, and I think what really underpins the findings of today's report is that while these police officers gathered information that was very useful for the Metropolitan Police when it came to policing protests, so if a large-scale demonstration by one of these groups was planned, they could work out where they were going to go, how likely it was to turn violent or not, and they could police appropriately. The inquiry judge basically found that the extreme tactics that they were using did not justify the quality of material that they got back from it. He said it wasn't worth it. The ends didn't justify the means, because as you've already been discussing, what these police officers were doing to get access to these groups was stealing the identities of children who had died. They were, in some instances, starting sexual relationships with women in these organisations and even fathering children with some of these women, at the same time as gaining access to people's homes through false pretences, and also, in some instances, taking quite senior positions in these groups. So today, a real reckoning yet again for the beleaguered Metropolitan Police, but the real report, the final report into the whole saga, well, that won't come out for another 3 years. The Metropolitan Police has apologised to victims and insisted that the way it operates now bears no resemblance to what was happening in the 70s.
OK, Rachel, thanks very much.
Well, of course they would say that, wouldn't they? I suspect if it is happening, it'd be wound up right straight away. But I suspect if we'd asked them, the Metropolitan Police 20 years ago, 30 years ago, were you doing these things? If anyone did ask them, they would have said, no, we're not doing these things. We would never do such a thing, until the report comes out and then finds out that they were doing it. So just because they're not saying they're not doing it, that doesn't actually mean that they aren't, because as we know, people don't tell the truth. And this is the real problem with humanity in general. When it comes to politicians, when it comes to every single person, is the ability to lie means that we can construct truth. Anyway, yeah, so that goes on to, when a lot of people say about these groups, in the past, these organisations, when they're infiltrated and all that kind of thing. This is the length that the police were going to get information. And there's the next one, the last bit of this, is a lady who it happened to her, giving her, how it happened to her and how high up it went. She talks about it went all the way up to the cabinet. So sanctioned from the government that we all vote in to do these kinds of things, to use dead people's babies. This is the kind of thing that terrorists or operatives use to hide their dealings. This is what the police, who are meant to protect us, were doing. I mean, I suppose they would say that they were trying to protect us by gathering information, but I suppose a lot of these organisations, I don't know if the lady says who she was working with, but a lot of these organisations, they weren't sort of like terrorist groups. If it was terrorist groups, maybe you could sort of say, well, okay, they were trying to, but these were just left-wing, organisations like maybe Just Stop Oil or Greenpeace or something like that, that were just wanting labour in or something like that, or just wanted social reforms. Anyway, it smacks a bit of the McCarthy of America, doesn't it? But here's the last bit of this real-life incident.
He met Mark at a public meeting at a community centre. We now know that he had been sent to target that community centre and basically everybody who was using it. He started coming to public events, and then he befriended us. He started a relationship with me. He moved in with people from the community and basically manipulated his way into all of our lives. I was in a relationship with him for 15 months. He was charismatic. He shared a lot of my interests. He was passionate about that I was doing.
Kate, I'm just going to jump in. We lost your audio there for a few seconds, so I just want to check you're okay. We can hear you okay. If you don't mind just continuing with what you were saying, but we just lost the last 15 seconds of what you were saying. You were talking about the undercover officer known as Mark, which ended up not being his real name, how you met him and then ended up in a relationship with him. Do continue. Sorry about that.
I had a relationship with a man who was a complete fiction. And what I now know about that relationship is that I didn't just have a relationship with a man who was a complete fiction. I had a relationship with an entire undercover unit. There were handlers, there were detective chief inspectors, there were people going right up what we see now from the report that's been released today, right up to commissioner level, right up to the Home Office, who were funding and tasking and organising and making decisions about whether I would go on holiday with my boyfriend, whether they got him to buy me gifts in order to increase the relationship and the bond. So it's very difficult now with everything I know to talk about the man that I thought I knew.
And obviously, just so viewers are clear, you were oblivious to all of this at the time. You thought you were in a genuine relationship with this guy that you'd met at the community centre. And what was your relationship like? Did you ever have any suspicions?
He was involved in everything we did. We ended up living together. He met my entire extended family as my boyfriend. And he went on to have relationships with close friends of mine. One relationship with one woman, Lisa, that lasted for 6 years. And it's still unimaginable to me that the police were doing that in order to undermine political movements.
And do you have any idea why you were targeted in this way by this undercover police officer?
I was targeted for my political beliefs and because I was involved in political campaigning. And what we're seeing now through the public inquiry is that the police were targeting everybody on the left. They weren't targeting the far right, but they were targeting everybody on the left. And it didn't matter what kind of organisation you were involved in. It didn't matter if you were an MP. They were targeting everybody on the left. So, I mean, what I feel today about this report, this report basically says these units were kept secret. If the public had known about them, they would have been shut down. If the authorities had done what they ought to have done and considered the human rights implications and the intrusion, there is no way that this would have happened. So I should never have met Mark. He should not have been there. That unit should not have existed. And it did exist because the Metropolitan Police, the government and the security services and MI5 were going out of their way to keep secret what was happening and to gather long-term intelligence on people who were politically organising in the UK.
Now, Kate, it was only after you'd broken up, several years after, that you found out that this whole relationship had essentially been a lie, that you had been in a relationship with someone who was in fact an undercover police officer. And not only that, he was also married, as I understand it. How did you find out?
I was told by friends of mine who had discovered the truth about his identity. So I received a phone call.
And how did you feel?
It's devastating. Obviously, it's devastating, and it's a very personal betrayal. In the beginning, I felt like I'd lost a friend. I mean, we broke up years before I found out, but he was one of my closest friends right up until the end. And it was like somebody had died. I think it's important to stress that that happened 13 years ago. And since then, I've discovered that 5 other people that I knew, people who lived with my friends, people who were involved in political movements that I was involved in, were also undercover police officers, and that this is much bigger than that personal betrayal. It's something that you know, what I felt 13 years ago and what I feel now after more than a decade trying to get justice. And I'm one of the lucky ones. I mean, as you said, I had the court case and I've received a lot of answers about what happened to me, but there's more than 200 court participants who were spied on in the public inquiry. There's 27 other women involved who had relationships with undercover officers like I did, and they still haven't been given their files. They still haven't been given answers. And what we're seeing now is that these operations were unlawful. They should not have been happening. And I don't think there's any grounds for the public inquiry or the police to be maintaining the levels of secrecy that they are. And it's those levels of secrecy that enabled this to go on for so long.
And for someone to come into your life in that way, physically, emotionally, seems a real violation. What impact has this experience had on your life?
The impact on me personally, on my ability to trust, on my ability to form relationships is obviously big. A major impact that it's had on my life is that I have been going through court battles and campaigning for more than a decade to get answers. I lost my 30s to trying to get a response from the Metropolitan Police, getting answers about why this was done and insisting that this was unlawful. And we are now finally being vindicated. And we have this report which says it was unlawful back in the 1970s. We have the ruling from my court case which says it was still unlawful in 2010. And now what we want is answers about why those institutional failings were able to go on for so long.
It's clear that the government knew about these operations at the time, but what doesn't get revealed in this report is who at the highest level signed off these tactics that were being used by these undercover officers. What does justice look like for you?
I think that going beyond justice, we need to look at making sure these kinds of human rights abuses cannot happen anymore. And I think it's really important to recognise that behind what happened is a culture within the Metropolitan Police that we've been hearing a lot about lately. The Metropolitan Police have been found to be institutionally racist, institutionally corrupt, and institutionally misogynist. And what we're seeing here, where they're spying on the far left, massively intrusive spying on groups that Mitting has said it was completely unjustifiable. They didn't warrant this kind of attention. And we need proper investigation of those institutional failings in order to, and safeguards put in place that mean that the police can't do this. And I don't think we can stress enough that if a police force that has already been found to have deeply problematic institutional failings in its culture is left in secret to make decisions about this kind of policing, this is just going to continue happening. And I noticed that in their statements today in response to this report, they have not said this will not be happening again.
Yeah, I was about to come to that exact point. The Metropolitan Police has refused to say to Sky News if these infiltration operations are still being used today when it comes to groups like Extinction Rebellion. Do you have any knowledge if they're still being used? And if they were, what would you say?
I have I have no knowledge. I do know that even after Mark had been uncovered, that there was still spying on me, at least up until 2014, which is 4 years after Mark had been discovered. I'm fairly sure that it's still going on. But what I think is that we need safeguards in place that mean that it can't. The police shouldn't be being given these powers, particularly for this kind of long-term intelligence gathering operation it's not about investigating crime. And you often, they talk about, the importance to investigating crime, but actually there's very little evidence that these officers were investigating crime. What they were doing was gathering information on private individuals in extremely intrusive and violating ways, and doing it for decades with nobody raising any questions, because inside the police, they have a culture whereby they thought this was okay. They thought that because we were political activists, our human rights were fair game and our bodies were fair game.
Just very briefly before I let you go, Kate, is there any knowledge that undercover female officers were treating male members of the public in the way that you were treated?
I believe that there were women undercover officers who did engage in sexual relationships with male members of the public. But I think that, what we know about the cultures inside the police and, what we hear from female police officers about the levels of misogyny and the attitudes inside the police, I think it kind of goes beyond a question of whether one or two undercover female officers, because there really weren't very many, were doing something similar. What we have is a very masculine culture. It's a boys' club, and the canteen culture that you hear about, and the WhatsApp groups that we've seen from Charing Cross Police Station, the way that these officers talk about women, and all the prosecutions that are now happening of police officers for sexual abuse. It's not a question of whether there were any female officers who did the same. This is about institutional misogyny in the police.
Kate Wilson, we really appreciate your time today. Thank you so much for sharing your story so bravely with us. Thank you.
So there you go. There was an example. It's amazing to think that's actually happening. No, that the police. It seems a bit like the Stasi. These kind of tactics, and yet they're happening in Western Europe. It's funny because if this had happened in Russia or China, the UN or whatever would be poo-pooing it. Look how terrible you are, and yet it's happening here. Because the thing is, like, the picture that's painted in people's minds is that somehow, the West is this great, democracy, and we do everything right, like in the films they're wearing the cowboys with the white hats. Where in reality, the murky truth, the waters of murky waters, is really that most countries are exactly the same. The leaders are, they may be less tainted than others, but they're still all tainted, and they're still all doing the same things. The same corruption's going on, the same institutions, because the countries are just blueprints for each other. It doesn't matter where you live in, whatever country, Russia, China, UK, US, Africa and the Middle East, wherever. Every country is a blueprint. They're all the same, aren't they? They all have the same institutions. They have different names to them, but they all have police, they all have schools, they all have, governments and post offices and banks, all money, all have the same things, despite being so far apart. And because the system is the same, the corruption is the same. It's just some of it gets reported and some of it doesn't, and whatever. And it's just another example, I feel, that's why I put it here, another example of the system that we're living, that we all know intrinsically, truthfully inside, does not work. Maybe we're too scared because we don't know if there is a better system than this one, because then it'll turn to anarchy. Maybe there isn't a better system than this one, but the truth is it's not working for humanity in general, because it allows this corruption by giving power that doesn't really exist, because we're all equally have the same amount of power, but by having these suits and these ideas of institutions. It gives people power and allows them to do these things that happen. That happens when you are wearing these suits. Whether you're a doctor, whether you're a politician, whether you're a banker, whatever you are. Not to say that the individual doesn't have the same as well, but I don't know. I would just like a world to wake up into a world where we don't have all these injustices and all these things happening, and that are unnecessary because they're not helping the benefit of humanity, and we need the help. Anyway, next time I'm going to talk about economy. I'm too tired to talk about it now. Take care, easy. God bless and peace.